The winter of 1863 hung over New York like a wet shroud, heavy with coal smoke and the smell of the river. Down by the harbor, where the fog rolled in from the Atlantic and the cries of dockhands mixed with the clang of metal, a small group of weary souls stepped off a wagon from the south. They were freedmen now, though the word freedom still trembled uncertainly on their tongues. Their backs bore the faint ghost of scars that no longer bled, but never healed. They had traveled from Georgia, from the rice plantations where the air was thick with mosquitoes and misery, to a city that promised wages, dignity, and a place to start again. What they found instead was a place that hated and needed them in equal measure. Josiah was the oldest among them, though barely 30. His hands were thick and calloused, the kind that remembered the weight of cotton sacks and the burn of rope. Beside him, his sister Leila clutched a wool shawl around her shoulders, shivering in the cold she had never known in the deep South. Behind them, two other men, Caleb and Nathan, watched the crowd of white workers unloading crates near the docks. The men didn't speak. Their silence was their shield. The city was full of noise, of men shouting, horses clattering, vendors calling out the day's bargains, and children running barefoot through puddles. But beneath that sound was a tension that hummed like a taut wire. It was the same year the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, and while some celebrated, others seethed. Rumors of draft riots drifted through the streets like ash from a fire not yet lit. A man in a dark overcoat approached them, his accent sharp and clipped, his boots polished like a soldier's. "You from Georgia?" he asked. Josiah nodded slowly. "Then you'll want to talk to Mr. Avery. He's got work for colored men. Honest pay if you can stand the cold." The man handed Josiah a slip of paper with an address scrawled in ink, then disappeared into the fog as quickly as he'd appeared. Leila looked up at her brother. "Do you think it's real?" she whispered. Josiah looked down the crowded street, where smoke from a nearby bakery drifted into the air, carrying with it a smell so strange and rich it made his stomach twist. "We'll find out," he said. By the time they reached the address, the sun had already dipped behind the jagged skyline of tenements. The building was small, wedged between a butcher shop and a tavern, with a sign that read Avery's Smokehouse and Grill. Inside, the heat hit them first, thick, smoky, alive with the scent of sizzling meat. Men stood behind a counter, pressing ground beef into flat, round patties that hissed as they touched the iron. The smell was intoxicating. Josiah had never smelled anything like it. On the plantation, meat was a rare thing, reserved for the overseer or the master's table. Here it was cooking in the open, its aroma spilling out into the street for all to breathe. A man emerged from behind the counter, wiping his hands on a stained apron. His beard was streaked with gray, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "Name's Thomas Avery," he said. "You're the folks from Georgia." Josiah nodded again, his posture straight but cautious. "We're looking for work, sir." Avery studied them for a moment, then gestured toward the kitchen. "You can start tonight if you've got the hands for it. The city's hungry and we're short-staffed." He turned to Leila. "You can help in the back, washing dishes. That all right?" Leila nodded silently. Avery smiled faintly. "Good. Then welcome to New York." The first night passed in a blur of motion and heat. Josiah shoveled coal into the stove until his arms ached. Caleb scrubbed the floor. Nathan carried buckets of water from the pump. Leila's hands were red from the cold, but she didn't complain. Every few minutes, Avery would call out an order: 2 sandwiches, 1 more for the dockhands. He'd take a piece of soft bread, place a slice of ground beef between it, and press it flat on the iron. When it was done, he'd flip it, layer it with onions and mustard, then close it in the bread. It was crude by modern standards, but to Josiah, it looked like something divine. He didn't even know what to call it. Late that night, when the rush was over and the lamps burned low, Avery noticed Josiah watching the grill. "You ever tasted one?" he asked. Josiah shook his head. Avery smiled and slid one of the warm sandwiches across the counter. "Go on, you earned it." Josiah hesitated, glancing at Leela, who stood nearby drying her hands. Avery nodded toward her. "There's enough for both." Josiah took the sandwich, its heat seeping into his fingers. The bread was soft, the meat glistening with fat. He broke it in half, handing the other piece to Leela. She took it carefully as though it might vanish. Together, they took their first bite. The taste was overwhelming. Salt, smoke, and something rich that melted on the tongue. For a moment, Josiah forgot the years of hunger, the nights spent dreaming of food he would never have. His eyes burned, and before he could stop it, tears welled up. Leela looked at him, her own eyes glistening, and let out a small laugh, half joy, half disbelief. It's like nothing I ever had," she whispered. Josiah nodded, unable to speak. The warmth spread through him, not just from the food, but from the realization that this, simple as it was something no master had ever given them. It was something they had earned by their own labor, on their own terms. Outside, the wind howled through the streets, carrying with it the sound of distant shouting. The city was restless, angry. Posters on the walls called for resistance to the draft. Men grumbled that they would not fight a war for Negro freedom. Josiah didn't understand all the words, but he felt the danger in them. He knew that freedom in New York was as fragile as a flame in a storm. Avery must have sensed it too. That night, as he closed the shutters, he said quietly, "You stay close to the shop for now. Folks out there, not all of them are happy to see you." Josiah nodded. He'd seen that look before, the same one overseers wore when they spoke of punishment. The next morning, the streets were quieter, but the tension hung thicker than the fog. As Josiah walked to the market for supplies, he passed a group of men reading a newspaper headline aloud, "Draft riots imminent." Their voices were sharp with anger. "Why should we die for Lincoln's NS?" One man shouted, another spat on the ground. Josiah kept his head down and walked faster. He could feel their eyes on his back, the weight of hatred that knew no reason. When he returned to the shop, Avery met him at the door. "You see them?" he asked. Josiah nodded. "They're stirring trouble. Best you all stay inside for a while." Avery sighed, rubbing his temples. God help this city. That evening, Avery's grill burned hotter than ever. Workers, soldiers, and travelers crowded in, demanding food and drink before curfew. The air buzzed with talk of war and rebellion. Somewhere in the distance, church bells tolled, their sound carried by the wind. Josiah worked without rest, his muscles burning, but he didn't mind. Every hiss of the grill, every plate served, felt like proof that he existed beyond the shadow of slavery. Leela hummed quietly as she scrubbed, her voice barely audible over the noise. For the first time in years, there was laughter between them, small, hesitant, but real. But just before midnight, a commotion erupted outside. A brick shattered one of the front windows. Someone screamed. Avery rushed forward, shouting for calm, but another stone flew, this time striking the door. The crowd outside was chanting something now, harsh, rhythmic, filled with rage. Josiah caught a glimpse of their faces through the broken glass, men in tattered coats, torches in hand, their eyes wild. "They're coming," Leela cried. Avery grabbed a shotgun from beneath the counter. "Get to the back," he ordered. The sound of boots echoed on the street. Josiah pulled Leela behind the stove, heart pounding. The smell of smoke grew stronger. The door burst open. A man stumbled in, his face lit by firelight. "They're burning the draft office," he gasped. "They're headed this way." Avery looked at Josiah. "We have to run, out the back now." Josiah grabbed Leela's hand and pushed through the narrow alley, the sound of chaos swelling behind them. Flames licked the sky, painting the snow orange. The city that had promised them freedom was burning. They ran until their lungs felt raw, until the shouts were distant echoes swallowed by the wind. When they finally stopped, Leela turned to him, breathless. "Where do we go now?" Josiah looked back toward the glow on the horizon, the city alive and furious. He didn't know, but for the first time he felt something stirring in his chest. Not fear, not hunger, a kind of defiance. The same fire that had kept him alive through years of bondage now whispered that freedom was not given. It was taken piece by piece, like the first bite of something new and forbidden. As dawn broke over the city, the smoke began to settle. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang again, slow and mournful. Josiah watched the gray sky lighten, the taste of that first hamburger still lingering faintly on his tongue, a reminder that even in the darkest times, a moment of humanity could cut through the ash. The morning after the fires, the city felt strangely hollow, as though the streets themselves were holding their breath. Smoke still curled upward from smoldering ruins, and the smell of burnt timber clung to the air. Josiah and Leela made their way carefully through the narrow alleyways, keeping to the shadows, moving away from the worst of the destruction. They had taken refuge for the night inside a cold, abandoned stables near the river. The horses were gone, the ground littered with old straw and rusted horseshoes. They had slept sitting up, backs against a wall, too afraid to close their eyes for long. When the first light crept through the cracks in the boards, Josiah realized they could not stay there. Leela's face was pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Do you think, Mr. Avery got away?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Josiah stared at the faint dirt tracks on the ground, imagining the chaos at the shop, the shattered glass, the smoke rising into the sky. "I don't know," he said, "but if he's alive, he'll come find us. He knows we had to run." He tried to sound certain, but doubt gnawed at him. Avery had been one of the few in this city who had shown them decency. If he was gone, they were alone again. They made their way toward the waterfront where the city was beginning to stir. Dock workers were already shouting, loading crates onto ships, their voices rough and tired. But something was different. There were soldiers now, rows of them, marching along the wharves and through the streets with rifles on their shoulders and bayonets fixed. The riots had changed everything. Freedom was no longer an unspoken possibility. It had become a reason for war within the city itself, and Josiah understood that even here, where he stood as a free man by law, there were those who would kill him simply because he was free. Caleb and Nathan were waiting near the riverbank, huddled beside a crate. Their clothes were singed and dirty, their eyes wide with the same fear Josiah felt. Caleb stood as they approached. "We looked for you," he said. "But the streets were too hot," thought maybe. He didn't finish the sentence. Nathan glanced toward the skyline where pillars of smoke still rose. "We can't go back to the shop. They'll burn that whole district before noon." Josiah knew he was right. Whatever sanctuary Avery's place had offered was gone, swept away by anger and chaos. They needed a new plan, but in a city as large and unforgiving as New York, a plan was something only the confident and the safe could afford. They had neither, yet survival demanded they keep moving. Caleb had heard talk of a church St. Mark's where free black men and escaped slaves found refuge. Priests there offered food, clothing, sometimes even work. It was dangerous to go there, though. Rioters had begun targeting abolitionist houses and black churches, but they had little choice. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, and the cold pressed against their bones. They made their way north, slipping past streets where men still lingered in angry clusters, clutching bricks or clubs, eyes sharp with resentment. The closer they came to St. Mark's, the quieter the streets became. The church stood like a gray stone sentinel on a hill, its tall windows dark and solemn. Smoke stains marked the walls, evidence of fires set and extinguished. The heavy wooden doors bore fresh cracks. Someone had tried to break them down, but the doors still held. Josiah pushed them open slowly. Inside, the church was dim and cool, lit only by a few candles flickering near the altar. The pews were mostly empty except for a handful of people, families wrapped in blankets, men with bandaged hands, women holding infants too young to understand why their mothers were crying. A priest emerged from behind the altar, his robe smudged with ash. He looked tired, but when he saw them, he offered a weary smile. "You're safe here," he said softly, for now. He led them to a small room in the back where food had been laid out, bread, a pot of stew, a pitcher of water. It was simple, but to Josiah and the others it felt like abundance. Leela ate slowly, as though fearing the meal might disappear if she reached too eagerly. Caleb let out a breath that shuddered in his chest. Nathan closed his eyes, murmuring a prayer. The priest introduced himself as Father Elias Carter. He had been helping escaped slaves long before the war, guiding them north through the same routes that made up the Underground Railroad. His voice was quiet but firm, the voice of someone who had seen too much suffering to believe in fear anymore. He listened as Josiah told what had happened at Avery's shop, how the riots had shattered the fragile sense of refuge they had found. Carter nodded. "These riots are only the beginning," he said. "There are those who would rather burn the world than see you free." His words settled heavy in the room. They stayed at the church for 2 days. During the day, they helped repair the walls and clean the burnt timber from the entryway. At night, they slept close to the others, huddled against the cold. Soldiers patrolled the streets now, though their presence brought tension rather than safety. Some soldiers supported emancipation, others despised it. It was hard to tell which was which until they spoke, so everyone kept their heads down. On the third morning, as Josiah helped carry water from the pump, he saw a familiar figure approaching the church. Avery. His coat was torn, his face bruised, but he was alive. When he saw Josiah and Leela, he let out a breath that seemed to deflate him entirely. "Thank God," he said. "I searched for you. I thought they'd—" He stopped. His voice cracked. Josiah stepped forward and clasped Avery's shoulder. For a moment the city fell away. The hatred, the riots, the hunger had all faded in the face of this small, fragile reunion. Avery had news. The soldiers were trying to restore order, but things were far from safe. Many businesses were destroyed, the docks were unstable, and worst of all, gangs were still roaming the streets, hunting for any black man they could find. "You can't stay here much longer," Avery said. "The church is a target. They'll come again." Father Carter agreed. The church had been spared for now only because the soldiers intervened, but that protection wouldn't last. The group needed to leave the city, at least until the riots died down, but leaving was dangerous. Roads out of the city were manned by angry mobs and soldiers suspicious of anyone traveling without purpose. Avery knew a possible way through the old freight tunnels beneath the northern district. The tunnels were dark, unstable, and partially flooded, but they offered a path to the countryside beyond the worst of the violence. It was a risk, a serious one, but every choice was a risk now, and Josiah realized that freedom was not a single moment, not a paper signed by a president, not a first taste of food shared among equals. Freedom was a path, narrow and shifting, where every step had to be chosen, every breath fought for. If they stayed, they would die. If they fled, they might live. That night, they prepared to leave. Father Carter packed what little supplies he had: bread, dried meat, a few blankets. Avery found a lantern and a small pistol. Caleb secured a length of rope. Nathan recited a verse under his breath, steadying his nerves. Leela wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders. Josiah stood at the door of the church and looked back one final time. The candles flickered against the stained glass, their light soft and trembling. They stepped into the night as quietly as shadows. The city was still, but not asleep. Somewhere a distant shout echoed. Somewhere else wood cracked as another building burned. The air tasted of smoke and cold iron. Avery led them to a narrow alley behind a boarded-up warehouse. Beneath a rusted grate lay the entrance to the tunnels. Josiah pulled the grate aside, revealing a black mouth in the earth. For a moment, no one moved. Then Leela reached out and took Josiah's hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was steady. Without a word, they climbed down. As the grate closed above them, the last light of the city disappeared, leaving only darkness, and the sound of water echoing far, far below. The darkness swallowed them whole the moment the grate clanged shut above. The air in the tunnel was damp, thick with the smell of earth, rust, and old water. Josiah held the lantern Avery had given them, its flame faint and flickering, casting long, trembling shadows on the tunnel walls. The light revealed only the nearest few feet ahead. Beyond that, the tunnel stretched into a black void. Leela's fingers were still clasped around his wrist, steady but tense. Behind them, Caleb and Nathan walked cautiously, each step measured. Avery led in front, his posture straight, though Josiah could see the stiffness in his movements, the exhaustion that simmered beneath his determination. The tunnel was originally built years ago, Avery had explained, intended for freight carts to move goods beneath the city during storms or blockades. But construction had been abandoned, and water had seeped in. Now it was half forgotten, spoken of only by smugglers and desperate men. The walls were lined with uneven stone, and water dripped steadily from cracks overhead. Their footsteps echoed, hollow and eerie, as though they were not alone. The deeper they went, the more distant the world above became, its fires, its hatred, its chaos. Down here, there was only the slow pulse of survival. Leela shivered. "Feels like we're walking into the belly of something," she murmured. Her voice was swallowed by the tunnel. Avery glanced back. "Keep close. These tunnels twist. You get separated, you might not find your way out." His words were simple, but Josiah heard the darker truth beneath them. Any had come here before, but not all had left. They continued forward for what felt like an hour, though time lost shape in the dark. The ground sloped downward gradually, and soon they were wading through ankle-deep water. The lantern's flame sputtered whenever Josiah lifted it too fast. The cold crept up his legs, numbing his feet. Nathan began to whisper prayers again, quiet and rhythmic. Caleb's breathing grew heavier, though he said nothing. At one point, they passed what looked like an old wooden cart half-submerged in the water, its wheels broken, its frame rotted. Avery paused, crouching to inspect the damage. "Long abandoned," he muttered, "but we're on the right path. There's supposed to be a junction ahead where the tunnels split. We'll take the left fork." The tunnel widened slightly, and the ceiling rose higher. Josiah took a deep breath, relieved to no longer feel the stone pressing overhead. But the relief was brief. Up ahead, the darkness thickened, the air grew colder, a faint sound echoed, something metallic scraping against stone. Josiah froze, raising the lantern. A figure emerged from the shadows. He was thin, gaunt, his eyes wild and sunken. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his body like a second skin. His hair hung in tangled strands, plastered to his forehead. For a moment, he simply stared at them. Then, in a voice brittle as cracked bone, he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." Avery stepped forward cautiously. "We're just passing through. We mean no harm." The man laughed, an eerie, hollow sound that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. "No harm," he repeated, shaking his head. "There's no such thing as no harm down here." His gaze lingered on Josiah, on Leela, on Caleb. "The city sends its broken down here. Some leave, most don't." Josiah noticed then the man was shivering, his hands trembling. He looked like someone who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks, maybe longer. "We don't want trouble," Josiah said quietly. The man blinked, his expression shifting briefly from madness to something like sorrow. "Then don't linger," he said, "not when the water rises." Before anyone could speak again, he turned and melted back into the darkness, swallowed whole as though he had never been there. Leela exhaled shakily. Caleb muttered, "Lord have mercy." Avery's jaw tightened. "Keep moving," he said, "and don't look back." They pressed on, but now the tunnel seemed heavier. Every drip of water, every echo of their footfalls felt like a warning. The path finally branched just as Avery had said. The left fork sloped upward slightly, while the right descended into deeper water. Avery led them left. The tunnel narrowed again, forcing them to move single file. Moss slicked the walls. The air smelled of iron and something faintly rotten. Leela stumbled once, and Josiah caught her arm, steadying her. "I'm all right," she whispered, though her voice trembled. After some time, the tunnel opened into a chamber where the ceiling arched high overhead. The lantern's light revealed remnants of old machinery, rusted gears, wooden beams, broken crates. This must have once been a loading station, where goods were sorted before being hauled above ground. Now it was silent except for the steady sound of dripping water, but something else caught Josiah's eye. Footprints, fresh ones, more than one set. Avery saw them too. He knelt beside the tracks, examining the impressions in the damp silt. "Men," he whispered, "several, and not long ago." Nathan's voice cracked. "Riots drove them down here too." Avery didn't answer. He didn't need to. Men driven by hate would go anywhere to hunt what they despised. A sudden clang echoed from somewhere deeper in the tunnels. Leela flinched. Josiah lifted the lantern higher. Shadows danced violently along the walls. Avery stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We move fast. Stay silent. If we run into them, don't stop to argue, don't plead, just run." They crossed the chamber quickly. The tunnel ahead sloped upward again, and Josiah felt hope spark faintly. If this path led out of the city, daylight couldn't be too far, but the scraping sound came again, closer now. Voices followed, male, harsh, drunken, angry. Josiah's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Avery gestured sharply. They pressed against the tunnel wall and extinguished the lantern. Darkness slammed down like a physical force. Josiah felt Leela clutch his coat tightly. The voices grew louder. "Swear I heard something. Down in this damn sewer. Keep lookin'. If there's runaways down here, we'll smoke 'em out." Smoke, fire. The memory of flames licking the sky flashed through Josiah's mind. The voices drew closer. Boots splashed through water. Josiah didn't breathe. For a moment the footsteps paused. Silence stretched like a drawn wire. Then slowly the voices receded, fading. Gone. Josiah exhaled only when his lungs ache burned. Avery relit the lantern with shaking hands. "We need to hurry," he whispered. They began to climb. The ground rose steadily, and eventually a faint, gray light appeared ahead. Daylight, real daylight. Josiah felt his chest tighten with something like relief, froth and aching. They emerged through a broken stone archway into the outskirts of the city. Ahead lay fields of frost-touched grass and bare winter trees. Beyond them, the open countryside, but the city was not fully behind them, because in the distance smoke still rose, and along the road columns of men marched, rifles glinting. The war had not been left behind. It was waiting for them, and freedom would demand more than escape. It would demand endurance and blood. The light of morning bled slowly across the horizon, gray and cold, painting the frost-bitten fields in silver. The group stood just beyond the mouth of the tunnel, squinting as their eyes adjusted after so many hours in darkness. The air above ground smelled of wet soil and burned wood, yet even that harsh scent felt cleaner than the suffocating air beneath the city. Josiah took a deep breath, feeling it scrape his lungs, as though he had been reborn from beneath the earth itself. For a moment there was only silence, broken by the far-off caw of a crow perched on a fence post. Avery scanned the road ahead. "We're near Harlem," he said quietly. "The countryside starts beyond those trees. We follow the rail line north. We might find a safe house or a farm still loyal to the Union." His face was pale, his beard streaked with soot, but his eyes were steady. He looked like a man who had made peace with danger long ago. Josiah nodded, glancing toward Leela, who wrapped her shawl tighter. "Do you think they'll follow us?" she asked. Avery didn't answer immediately. "Maybe," he said finally, "but they'll have bigger fires to chase now. Come on, keep close." They walked through fields where snow still clung to the furrows and crows picked at the earth. The sun climbed slowly, dim behind thin clouds. Every so often, they heard the distant rumble of drums and the faint thunder of marching boots, Union soldiers, moving south toward the harbor to suppress the riots. The sound reminded Josiah that the country itself was tearing apart, each piece pulling away from the other. The war was no longer something far away. It was in the streets, the smoke, the hunger that haunted every face they saw. By noon, they reached a small stream winding through the fields. Avery called for a rest. They drank from the cold water and shared what little bread remained. Caleb's hands shook as he ate. Nathan's eyes were distant, staring toward the city they had left behind. "Do you think they'll ever stop fightin'?" Nathan asked softly. "Seems like there's no end to it. First the masters, now the mobs. Maybe it's the same thing in different clothes." Josiah didn't reply. He remembered the overseer's whip, the long nights under the stars, the prayers whispered into the dark. Freedom had always been painted as a door that opened wide, but stepping through it, he had only found another hallway lined with locks. They moved again before the sky began to darken. The road grew rougher, winding through groves of bare trees that groaned in the wind. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked, then fell silent. Avery lifted a hand, signaling them to stop. Through the trees ahead, faint smoke rose from a chimney, a farmhouse. It looked old but sturdy, a split rail fence marking its edge. "Could be safe," Avery murmured. "Could be trouble." Caleb frowned. "We can't stay out here all night. If the soldiers find us," Avery nodded. "I know. We'll go slow." They approached quietly. The front door of the farmhouse stood slightly open, swinging with the wind. Inside, the faint light of a dying fire flickered. Avery stepped first across the threshold, his pistol drawn. The air inside was cold, carrying the stale smell of ash and boiled potatoes. Chairs were overturned, and a table lay on its side. No one answered when Avery called out. Josiah followed, scanning the room, looks abandoned. He said, but then Leela gasped softly. A figure sat slumped in a corner, an old woman wrapped in a shawl, her skin pale as paper. Her eyes flickered open when she heard them. "Who's there?" she croaked. Avery knelt quickly, lowering his weapon. "We mean no harm, ma'am. We're travelers from the city." The woman studied their faces with clouded eyes. "You're running from it, then," she whispered. "Smart folk would." She coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "My sons went to join the army. Haven't heard from 'em since. Left me with an empty house and a ghost for company." Avery helped her sit up. "You shouldn't be alone," he said. The woman smiled faintly. "Ain't much choice. The world's gone mad." Her gaze drifted to Josiah and Leela. "You too, from the south." Josiah hesitated. "Georgia," he said finally. The woman nodded slowly. "You came far. The Lord must have plans for you yet." Her voice softened. "There's food in the cellar, not much, but it's yours. I don't eat much these days." They stayed that night in the farmhouse. The fire burned low, casting orange light across the cracked walls. Josiah sat by the window, watching the fields vanish under darkness. He could see stars now, sharp and cold, unlike the hazy skies of Georgia. Leela lay on a cot near the fire, asleep, her face peaceful for the first time in days. Avery sat across from him, cleaning his pistol with slow precision. "You've seen more than any man should." Avery said quietly, "Most wouldn't have made it this far." Josiah shrugged. "We had to. If we stop moving, we go back to being what we were." Avery looked up, eyes tired. "You're free now, Josiah. No one owns you." Josiah met his gaze. "Maybe, but a man's got to eat to stay free. He's got to find a place that don't see him as less." He paused. "Have you found that place?" Avery didn't answer. The fire popped softly between them. Outside, the wind howled like something ancient and restless. In the middle of the night, a noise woke them, distant hooves on frozen ground. Avery was up in an instant, motioning for silence. Josiah moved to the window. Lanterns flickered along the road. Riders. Soldiers or raiders, it didn't matter. Either meant danger. Avery whispered, "Basement, now." They roused Leela and helped the old woman to her feet. She nodded without panic, as though she had expected this for a long time. The cellar door creaked as they descended into the dark. The smell of earth and potatoes filled the air. Avery closed the hatch just as the hooves stopped outside. Voices, rough, slurred, laughing. House looks lived in. Another voice, "Check it," could be runaways. Josiah's heart hammered. He could see the faint light through the cracks above. Boots thudded across the floor. A chair scraped. The old woman's breathing was shallow. One of the men above said, "Ain't nothing here but old bones." Then, after a pause, another voice, colder. Search anyway. A moment later the hatch was yanked open, light stabbed down, a man's face appeared above, shadowed by his hat brim. "Well, well," he drawled, "what we got here?" He started to climb down. Avery raised the pistol silently, eyes narrowed. But before he could fire, the old woman spoke. "Leave them." Her voice was sharp, commanding. The man froze, startled. "Ma'am, these are guests," she said. "My guests? You'll not harm them?" Her frail body shook as she climbed the steps, blocking his way. "You got no right to my house." For a moment no one moved. Then the man laughed, uneasy. "Didn't mean no harm, ma'am." He backed away. "Come on, boys. Ain't nothin' worth the trouble." Their boots retreated, fading into the night. When the sound was gone, Avery exhaled shakily and climbed out first. The old woman stood by the door, her shoulders trembling but unbroken. Josiah helped her sit. She smiled faintly, still some good left in words, if you say 'em loud enough. At dawn, they buried the ashes of the fire and packed what little food remained. The woman refused to go with them. "My bones belong to this land," she said simply. "You all carry on. You've got a road ahead that needs walking." Josiah took her hand gently. "Thank you." She squeezed his fingers. "Don't thank me. Just keep walking." They followed the rail line north as the sun climbed. The land slowly began to change, hills rising, woods thickening. The sound of the city grew fainter, replaced by the soft rhythm of their boots and the whisper of wind through dry grass. Yet even as they left the smoke behind, Josiah felt the weight of it following, like a shadow stitched to his back. Freedom had not yet become peace. It was still a journey. Near midday, they spotted figures on the horizon, Union soldiers resting beside a supply wagon. Avery motioned for caution, but the soldiers noticed them first. One of them raised a hand in greeting. The group hesitated. These men wore the blue coats of Lincoln's army, yet even that color didn't always mean safety. The officer approached, his expression guarded. "Where you folks headed?" he asked. Avery answered carefully, "North, looking for work. The city's in ruins." The officer nodded slowly. "You'd best keep clear of it. Rioters still burning blocks near the docks." His gaze lingered on Josiah and Leela. "You two came a long way, I reckon." Josiah met his eyes without flinching, further than most. The officer studied him for a moment longer, then sighed. "There's a camp 2 miles up, colored regiment recruiting. They need strong hands, good hearts. Might find safety there if you're willing to fight." The word hung in the air, fight. Josiah looked toward Leela, then at Avery. He thought of the fires, of the chains, of the endless running. "Maybe it's time," he said quietly. Avery nodded once, then "Let's go." As they walked toward the camp, the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and cooking meat. Josiah paused, recognizing it instantly, the same scent that had once filled Avery's shop that first night in New York, the scent of food made by free hands, eaten without permission. His chest tightened. He didn't know what awaited them at the camp, or whether freedom would ever truly feel whole. But for the first time since the city burned, he felt the stirrings of something fierce and steady. Not fear, not weariness, resolve. He took Leela's hand and kept walking. The road leading toward the encampment wound between sparse trees and frost, covered grass, the earth marked by wagon ruts that had hardened into grooves. The cold had grown sharper as the sun stretched thin across the sky, more light than warmth. Josiah walked at the front now, not out of pride but because something inside him felt pulled forward, as though the ground itself was urging him on. Leela walked beside him, her hands tucked into her shawl, her breath a faint mist in the air. Caleb and Nathan followed quietly, heads lowered, while Avery kept a slow, steady pace behind them, eyes alert for anything unnatural in the silence. As they approached the Union camp, the shape of it rose gradually, rows of canvas tents, smoke rising from cooking fires, men gathered in small groups. Some wore uniforms crisp and blue, others wore coats patched and faded, boots mismatched, faces drawn thin by hunger and cold. And among them were men who looked like Josiah, men whose skin carried the same sun, deep brown of fields and hard labor, men whose backs bore the memory of the whip, whose eyes contained a quiet fire that had not been extinguished. The sound of drums rolled across the cold air, a slow, rhythmic cadence. A flag snapped overhead, 13 stars in a ring, a different flag than the one flown in southern fields. For a moment, Josiah wasn't sure what he felt. This was not quite a place of belonging, yet it was not one of chains either. It was something between, a threshold, a crossing. A soldier approached them, a tall black man with a uniform coat that looked a size too large. His gaze was sharp, measuring, but not suspicious. "You coming to join the regiment?" he asked. His voice was steady, controlled, as though he had learned to choose each word before speaking it. Josiah hesitated. "We heard there was work, a place to stay." The soldier nodded once. "There is, but nothing comes free, brother. You stay here, you fight. You run, you fight. That's the world now." He extended a hand. "Name's Corporal Amos Ward." Josiah shook his hand. The grip was firm, grounding. "Josiah." The others spoke their names in turn, and Amos nodded. "Come on. Captain will want to look you over. Not everyone walks in from the city with their skin intact. Means you've survived something." They followed Amos through the camp. Men sharpened bayonets, stacked crates, rolled powder cartridges. The smell of smoke blended with something richer, the fragrance of meat cooking in iron pans. Josiah felt his stomach tighten, remembering that night in New York, the warmth of the tavern, the taste of something he had never known existed. It felt like a memory from another lifetime. They reached a tent near the center of camp. A Union captain stepped out as they approached. He was a white man, perhaps in his 40s, with deep lines etched around his eyes. He studied them with careful attention. Neither cold nor warm. "Refugees from the city?" he asked. Avery answered. "Escaped from Georgia, passed through New York during the draft riots." The captain's eyes flicked with recognition. "Then you already know what war smells like." He sighed and crossed his arms. "This regiment is new, first of its kind to form here. We're marching south soon, Port Hudson, maybe Charleston. If you stay, you'll fight hard." There was no threat in his words, only truth. Josiah met his gaze. "If fighting is the price of being free, then the price was always coming due." The captain nodded once. "Then you'll be assigned quarters. Tomorrow morning you'll be drilled. I'll have rations brought." As they left the captain's tent, Amos led them to a fire where a large iron pan sizzled. A soldier stirred the meat with the edge of a flat metal spatula. The smell was unmistakable. Fat, salt, browned edges sizzling. Josiah froze. It was the same sound, the same scent. The soldier cooking looked up and grinned. "First meal is always the hardest," he said. "You eat fast, you choke. You eat slow, someone steals your portion. Learned that in the Navy." He pressed the meat flat, steam rising around him. "Ain't fancy, but it'll keep you breathin'." He slid the food, thick browned patties on, to stale bread and handed one to each of them. Josiah stared at his hands. The bread was rough but warm. The meat glistened with rendered fat. For a moment he was back in Avery's shop, the air humming with the bustle of the city outside, the glow of possibility. That had been the first time he tasted freedom, even if only for a breath. He took a bite. The taste hit him like something fierce and boundless. Smoke, salt, heat, and beneath it something deeper. He remembered the plantation cook fires, the smell of pork scraps thrown to the enslaved, the hunger that made men into shadows. This was not that. This was a meal that belonged to him because he had taken it with his own hands, walked through fire to reach it. Leela ate slowly, eyes closed. Caleb devoured his as though afraid someone would take it away. Nathan ate quietly, staring at the flames. Avery hadn't taken a portion yet. He stood apart, gaze distant. Josiah walked to him. "You should eat too." Avery shook his head slightly. "Not yet." Josiah realized then that Avery was thinking of the shop, the customers, the city that might never return to what it had been. "You left something behind," Josiah said softly. Avery looked at him. "I left everything behind, except the part that kept me human." He took the food at last. Night fell deep and wide over the camp. The drums had gone silent. Tired men lay beneath rough blankets, letting the cold settle into their bones. Josiah could not sleep. The stars overhead were clearer than they had been in the city, sharp, cold points of light scattered across blackness. He wondered how many men in how many places looked at them now and dreamed of something better. Leela sat beside him, her shawl drawn tight. "Do you regret coming this far?" she asked. Josiah shook his head. "No, I just didn't think freedom would be a road without an end." Leela looked up at the stars. "Maybe freedom isn't a place. Maybe it's something you keep choosing every day." He thought about that a long time. At dawn, the sound of a bugle broke the silence. Men rose, pulling on coats, tightening belts. The cold air was sharp enough to sting. The captain stood near the center of the camp. "Form ranks," he called. Amos walked to Josiah. "Time to learn how to stand before a battlefield stands before you." Josiah nodded. His muscles were tired, but something inside him was steady. They formed lines. The drills began. March, turn, shoulder arms, aim, reload, march again. The morning stretched into noon, sweat mixed with cold, with breath fogging the air. Nathan stumbled, but Caleb caught him without a word. Leela watched from the side, her eyes steady. Avery observed the lines, evaluating form, posture, discipline. Josiah moved with a rhythm he did not know he had. Each motion felt like a step into something larger than himself. When the drills ended, men collapsed beside fires. Josiah sat alone for a moment, staring down at his hands. They were rough, scarred, calloused, but they were his hands, his movements, his life. A message rider arrived near sunset, dust staining his coat. He spoke urgently with the captain. The captain's jaw tightened, and his voice carried across the camp. "Orders have come. We march south tomorrow. A Confederate column has been spotted near the river crossings. We meet them before they move north." Silence settled over the camp like heavy snowfall. Some men looked afraid. Some looked determined. Some simply looked tired. Josiah did not know what he looked like, but he felt something rise in him, not rage, not fear, purpose. As night fell, the fires burned low. The camp was still, the stars bright, and Josiah, lying on a thin bedroll, felt the road behind him and the road before him, and understood something simple and unbreakable. He had walked too far to go back, and the world would never again decide what he was. He would decide that himself. The night before the march was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The campfires had burned down to embers, giving off faint red glows that pulsed like tired hearts. Men slept where they could, some stretched out on bedrolls, others sitting upright against tree trunks. Rifles leaned beside them. Even the horses were silent, shifting only occasionally in the cold. The moon hung thin and sharp above, casting a pale light across the frost, touched grass. Josiah lay awake, his blanket wrapped tight around him. The ground beneath him was hard, but it was not chains or boards or damp earth. His breaths rose in white clouds. The thoughts in his head would not quiet. His body was exhausted, but his mind kept returning to the same point, a distant field in Georgia where he had once knelt beside a row of tobacco plants, hands raw, shoulders aching, the overseer's voice barking commands that carved themselves into bone. Back then, the world felt small, sealed, unchangeable. But here, lying beneath a vast sky, the world felt too large, full of paths he could not yet see. Beside him, Leela slept lightly, her breathing soft and steady. There was less fear in her face now, though it had not disappeared. Caleb snored softly nearby, exhaustion having claimed him quickly. Nathan's whispered prayers had gone quiet an hour earlier, his hands still loosely clasped around a smooth pebble he carried everywhere. Avery sat near what was left of the fire, staring into the embers as though reading something in them. He looked older than he had when Josiah first met him, like something in him had been burned away, leaving only whatever remained essential. Josiah sat up quietly and moved to sit beside Avery. For a while they said nothing. The embers crackled softly. Avery did not look away from the fire. "You can't sleep either," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Josiah shook his head. "Too much waiting," he said. Avery nodded. "Waiting is its own kind of pain." A moment passed. "Do you think we'll win?" Josiah asked. The question came out quieter than he expected. Avery finally looked at him. His eyes were tired but clear. "Not all battles are won in one day," he replied. "Victory isn't always a flag or a parade. Sometimes it's just living to see another sunrise. Sometimes it's keeping a promise to yourself. Sometimes it's refusing to let the world decide your worth." Josiah absorbed those words slowly, the way one might taste something new and unexpected. He nodded. Avery added, "But yes, I think we can win. Maybe not quickly, maybe not easily, but the ground always shifts when enough feet march across it." They fell silent again, but it was a different silence now, less heavy, less alone. At dawn, the bugle cut through the cold air, sharp and unwavering. Men stirred, groaning softly as they awoke. The frost on the ground had thickened overnight, making every breath sting. Josiah stood, muscles stiff, joints aching, but his movements were sure. He helped Leela wrap her shawl more tightly. Caleb stretched his back with a grunt. Nathan crossed himself silently. The regiment formed ranks. The captain stood before them, his voice clear and steady as he addressed the men. "The column we chase is not large, but it is fast. If they reach the river, they may receive reinforcements. We move quickly and strike hard. Do not break formation. Do not act before orders." His gaze swept the line. "Remember, you are soldiers, not property, not fugitives, soldiers." The word hung in the air, unfamiliar but powerful. They began to march. The road south cut through barren fields and clusters of leafless trees. The ground crunched beneath their boots. The sun climbed slowly, faint and distant. Men carried rifles slung across their shoulders, cartridge boxes at their hips, canteens clinking softly. Josiah felt the weight of the weapon in his hands, not just the weight of iron and wood, but the weight of what it meant. This tool could decide life. This tool could defend something precious. This tool could be used to reclaim what had been taken. Leela rode on a supply wagon, wrapped in blankets. Avery rode beside her, speaking quietly, pointing out landmarks, explaining the terrain. Josiah walked near the front with Caleb and Nathan. Caleb set a steady pace, his frame solid despite his age. Nathan's lips moved silently, praying or chanting or simply speaking to the air. Around midday, they stopped to rest. Fires were lit quickly, rations distributed. Hardtack, dried meat, bitter coffee. Josiah sat with his back against a tree, watching the horizon. The land felt open in a way that made him uneasy. Too much sky, too many directions trouble could come from. Caleb sat beside him. "You thinking about tomorrow?" Caleb asked. Josiah nodded. "And yesterday?" he replied. Caleb grunted softly. "Yesterday is done. Tomorrow ain't come yet. Best we stand firm in the day we got." The words were simple but steadying. They marched again. The land changed as they moved south. The fields gave way to marshy ground, the smell of river water growing stronger. Birds circled overhead, large ones, silent and watchful. The air grew thicker, colder. The captain called a halt near a stand of trees as the sun dipped low. "We hold here," he said. "Scouts will go ahead." Amos approached Josiah. "Come with us," he said. Josiah nodded immediately. The scouting party moved quietly, boots muffled by damp grass. The river shimmered faintly in the distance. They could see movement near its banks, figures, horses, wagons, Confederate soldiers, not many, but enough to fight, enough to kill. Amos raised a hand. The scouts crouched in the brush. "We strike before dawn," Amos whispered, "while they're still cold and half asleep." Josiah nodded, feeling his heartbeat thrum steadily. Not fast, not panicked, just awake. They returned to camp. The captain briefed the men. The plan was simple. They would move in two lines, one to encircle the camp, the other to strike fast and loud, driving confusion into their ranks. It would happen quickly. It would be chaos, but with discipline it could work. That night the camp was silent again, but the silence was different than before. It was anticipation, steady, controlled, purposeful. Leela sat beside Josiah. "Promise me something," she said softly. Josiah looked at her. What? Her eyes were steady even in fear. Promise me that no matter what happens tomorrow, you will not let the world take you back, not in body, not in spirit." Josiah swallowed. "I promise," he said. She nodded. "Then I will not be afraid." Before dawn they moved. The river mist was thick, curling around them like ghost white smoke. The cold dug deep into their bones, but no one shivered. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft rhythm of boots and breath. The Confederate camp emerged through the fog lanterns dim, fires dying, men sleeping close to the embers. The Union captain raised his hand. A single moment stretched, then advance. The world exploded, rifles cracked, men shouted, horses whinnied in terror, flames leapt as a tent caught fire. Josiah charged forward, heart hammering, his rifle held steady. A Confederate soldier rose from his bedroll, eyes wide. Josiah's shot was clean, not perfect, not graceful, but true. Caleb fought beside him, moving with the weight of years, slow but unbreakable. Nathan fired and reloaded, his prayers now shouted rather than whispered. Amos drove forward, issuing commands that cut through the chaos with sharp clarity. Avery stayed near Leela, shield raised, positioning her behind the supply wagons. The battle was not long. Surprise carried weight. And the Confederate troops, startled awake, scattered under the force of the assault. Some fled toward the river, abandoning supplies, abandoning weapons. Some fought and fell. Some surrendered with shaking hands. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. Breath steamed in the cold morning light. The river mist began to lift. The world grew quiet again, but differently now. Josiah stood amidst the quiet, his rifle held loosely. His hands were steady. He did not feel hollow. He did not feel shattered. He felt present, alive, changed. Leela approached slowly, her shawl pulled tight. She looked at him, eyes searching. "You're still you," she said. Relief flickered through him. "Yes," he said softly, "I am." But he was not the same. None of them were. They gathered what supplies they could. The sun rose, pale and thin, casting long shadows across the ground. The march would continue. The war was not over, but neither were they. Night fell slowly upon the city, but for them, this night was different from all nights before. The lights of New York flickered faintly in the damp air, coal smoke drifting up chimney stacks into a heavy sky. The noise of the streets had quieted, and the world felt as if it were holding its breath. Josiah and Leela walked slowly through the narrow alley that stretched behind the butcher's shop, the same place where they had tasted the hamburger for the first time when they arrived from Georgia. The memory of that day still lingered in their minds, the warmth of the bread, the smell of the meat, the feeling of being treated as something human for the very first time. It was a taste they had never known, a moment that felt like a doorway to another kind of world. But that world was fragile. The riots had changed everything. The streets that once felt open were now filled with whispers. Some looked at them with curiosity, some with suspicion, some with the same familiar hatred that they thought they had left behind. There was talk of new laws, of who belonged and who did not. And still, no matter how many times Josiah tried to push it away, the memory of the plantation still clung to his bones. Caleb had grown weaker. The journey, the cold, the hunger, it had all taken a toll. Leela watched him from the doorway, her hands trembling as she held a cracked cup of warm broth. His breathing was slow, heavy, like each breath had to be pulled from deep inside him. The man who once stood tall in the fields of Georgia now lay small and fragile beneath a thin blanket. Josiah knelt beside him. Caleb's eyes opened slowly. "You too listen to me, one last time." Caleb whispered, voice rough like gravel. "No," Leela said softly, shaking her head, tears already forming. "You're not going anywhere." Caleb smiled, not with joy, but with the quiet acceptance of a man who had seen the truth of the world and no longer wished to fight it. "I lived my whole life with chains on my hands," he said, "but I got to see you taste freedom, even if it was just one bite. Even if it was just one hamburger, that was enough, because I saw you see yourselves as people, not property. Josiah lowered his head. Caleb, we're going to make it. We'll live. I swear it. Caleb reached up, placed his rough, calloused hand on Josiah's face. You already have. The world ain't changed yet. But you have. That's where it starts. The air in the room grew still. Caleb exhaled slowly and did not inhale again. Leela broke. She did not weep loudly. Her sorrow was silent, heavy, aching. Josiah held her as she shook. The city outside continued moving, unaware that one man's journey had ended, and two new journeys had just begun. Later, as dawn approached, Josiah and Leela stepped outside. The sky was pale, the streets were quiet, life, fragile and cruel, still continued, but something inside them had changed. They were no longer just survivors. They were witnesses of a story bigger than hunger, bigger than slavery, bigger than fear. They walked together toward the harbor, where the ships came and went, where new lives could begin if one dared. Leela looked at Josiah. What happens now? She asked. Josiah took a slow breath, the cold morning air filling his lungs. We go forward, he said, not back, never back. And they walked not as slaves, not as fugitives, but as people carrying the memory of a taste that